2, 1.
So a key aspect of challenging segregation is the Supreme Court, is the judicial branch. And in order to understand how civil rights really begins to gain momentum, it's not just about people marching. It's not just about people sitting in. It's not just about protests or anything like that. A big piece of this and a big part of the start has to do with the checks and balances system. And that's really what this picture describes. We have three equal branches of government. And these branches of government are the legislative, which is Congress, Capitol Hill, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, the executive branch, which is the president, and then the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court. You can see this kind of breaks it down, the different aspects of the three branches of government. And then the other big component is exactly what they get to do. And so that's really the overall idea that we need to focus on here. So beginning in the 1950s, you have what is called the Warren Supreme Court. Chief Justice Earl Warren, who is kind of takes a interpretive, some would call it an activist, some would call an open, a loose interpretation of the Constitution. In other words, he looks at the Constitution as being more than what is literally in black and white and being more than what the founders intended. He sees the Constitution as being, what is the intent? What was the spirit? What was the meaning behind this? And so when Warren himself and then all the other justices on this court are evaluating these key pieces of legislation that we've talked about, Sweat v. Painter and Brown v. Board and numerous others that we're going to be talking about later on, all of those are definitely going to be things that they're interpreting as kind of what was the intent? How does this fulfill the meaning and intent of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and these values that de Tocqueville talked about if you remember back from the beginning of the semester, the things in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. So you can see the legislative branch makes laws, approves appointments, senators and congressmen, representatives. So that's how the legislative branch functions. And the big thing is they make laws, right? They also, as you learned from the War Powers Act, have the power to declare war. The executive branch signs the laws, so he can sign them or veto them based on whether he thinks they're a good idea. He can issue executive pardons. He can appoint judges, federal judges, and he faces election every 4 years. The judicial branch has a very different position, right? They are appointed by the president. They have to be approved by Congress. They serve for life. Or unless they're kicked off. Now, you do have some state level judges that have to run for election, but federal judges do not. They decide if laws are constitutional. Just here recently, we had a court say, you know what, the travel restrictions are not constitutional, and so we throw those out. And that challenged the power of the president and his executive order. So the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, can do this. This is the power that's been designated to them by the Constitution. Even if people interpret what they're doing is too much, it goes too far, or it's too open to interpretation. This is one of the debates about the Supreme Court justice and the open position on the Supreme Court is whether or not who is going to be appointed. Is it somebody who's going to take a very strict, very literal interpretation of the Constitution? What does it say in black and white? Or is it going to be somebody who's going to be more open, have a looser interpretation and say, hey, I'm going to think about what is the intent, what is the meaning, what is the outcome, all that kind of stuff. And so you have 9 justices on the Supreme Court, and they can overturn rulings, right? The Supreme Court is the top. There's a hierarchy that goes on there. And so they're the top of that hierarchy. And so there's a process by which things work through the court system. So if you look at the civil rights movement, right, be sure you understand the notion of an activist court that creates new applications for the Constitution. They focus very much on making sure that every person's vote counts. this idea that voting is crucial and central to what we do. And to citizenship. And so they support that over and over again. And as far as strengthening the 14th Amendment and what citizenship means. And this is particular to the civil rights era. They also believe in due process. You see a lot of strengthening of the due process and the rights of the accused during this period, protecting you, court-appointed attorneys, which are not specified in the Constitution, but essentially the Supreme Court says you should have those, right? Otherwise, you're disadvantaged. You should have an access to a lawyer. You have the right to remain silent, which is the Miranda rights. And so all of these things about civil rights and due process and opportunity and equality come from this activist Supreme Court. They're also going to support things like free speech and freedom of religion. They're going to do a lot of things that really protect people's individual rights and freedoms. And a lot of these rulings that they make are interpretations of what the intent and what the outcome of restrictions are. And this is very different when you have justices that want to interpret things very literally. So this is a key component of understanding the civil rights movement, especially since court cases and working through the legal system is one of the main ways that people push for civil rights. Now, yes, you have marches and protests and sit-ins and that kind of thing. You have that sort of activity. But the court cases are another big one. Amendments to the Constitution, like the 24th Amendment, later on the 26th Amendment, those things matter. Legislation like the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, all of those are ways that the civil rights movement happens and like literally impacts the way people live. So I wanted to be sure that you understood that. So that's why I kind of did this separately. And so if you have any questions about this, please let me know.